Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to EIG's second in a series of webinars with featured partners SCMBLOX, Chris White, Dr. Chris White, and the
Yes.
Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium, Greg Schlegel. And today our topic is the physics of supply chains and buffer inventories, lead times, and flow dynamics. Very exciting. We appreciate you taking the time today to attend today's webinar on building an evolving resilient enterprise. That's our ethos, and we'll hopefully provide you insights to making key decisions in operations all the way to the executive level. And of course, we hope that your family are healthy and safe. Again, this is the second in a series of webinars. The first webinar was on structural modeling impact. That's on the EIG website and available at any time to pull down. And if you don't have the slides, just send me an email and I will be more than glad. You should have received an email this morning. If you did not, ping me on LinkedIn. And this is the webinar today on physics of supply chains. Next month, we'll get into redesigning the chain, modeling the strategic implications of tariffs, onshoring, and restructuring. We purposely kept that for September because that will be an exciting one because that's when we'll find out what really is the impact of the tariffs. The next webinar will be in October, beyond the dashboard, stress testing, supply chains, and structural modeling add-ons that will get into different tools that are out there like Resilink, our new ChainSight AQ, and other types of modeling besides our own and that are our partners. And then we'll get into mapping the terrain, navigating the supply chain tech landscape for tactical and strategic advantage. So with that, I just wanted to again thank Greg and Chris. They'll give their introductions here in right now. So I'll just turn it right over to Greg right after the deliverables. So the deliverables today, how buffer inventories, lead times, and cycle times dictate true agility across a multi-tier network. Our next deliverable is why siloed decision-making in misaligned policies amplifies systemic risk and reduce trust. So we're going to be getting into trust a bit in this webinar and linking it to decision-making. Then we'll, of course, have Chris and his structural modeling tool to help us expose the physics of supply chain behavior and unlock scalable resilience. And then we'll get into some actionable framework for embedding resilience into operating models, governance, and incentive structures. So please do ask questions throughout the webinar because we're trying to cover an awful lot of ground in this short 1 hour or so webinar. With that, I turn it over to Greg.
You bet. Thanks a lot, Jim. Pleasure to be here with you today. An exciting topic, we feel. Just a real quick thumbnail sketch of who we are and what we do. We are 33 companies. That's about 1,700 supply chain risk pros around the globe. We identify, assess, mitigate, and manage supply chain risks. That's all we do. We have 3 pillars on the right. We grew up under education in universities and with partners. We do a lot of consulting where we lead, guide, direct, and coach companies on their journey. And we got a host of heavy hitter software as a service companies who reinforce supply chain risk and resiliency from our book. All right, on the left-hand side, we have 5 offerings, more or less. We have 2 certificate courses online. You can take them. One is for manufacturers and the other is for public health care service organizations, and you receive a certificate at the end of the course. We have an online readiness assessment, supply chain online readiness assessment. That first tier is free. You can go on the website and evaluate your supply chain process maturity for free. We have another tool, the supply chain risk and resiliency assessment tool, mainly regarding risk, and it looks at your risk maturity level, your company's risk appetite, and your company's operating culture. The first element of that is free. You can evaluate where you are on our 5-stage model for free, going to the website under that particular assessment tool. And again, we do coaching and consulting, and we have a host of heavy hitting platform solutions that support track and trace and supply chain risk and resiliency. All right, back to Chris.
Fantastic. Thanks, Greg. Chris White, co-founder and CEO of SCMBLOX. We developed SCMBLOX. It's a structural modeling tool primarily for long-term strategic what-if scenarios developed for the military. And it's commercial. We're commercializing it now, so it's available. And I won't get into a lot of it. You'll see it in action, but it basically helps you with supply chain designs, understanding how various risk kind of ripple through the system of the supply chain and what that means to you, and helps you prioritize risk and understand, helps you do any kind of end-to-end analysis that you want to do. And but you'll see it in action. So I'll go ahead and pass back to Jim on this one, and you'll see that in a bit.
First, you're so humble with all your accomplishments here. So, Chris has got a plethora of tools. SCMBLOX is one. Of course, it's got PCBLOX, a project management tool. So there's a lot of things. So reach out to Chris if you have any questions at all. He has a very deep knowledge of a lot of different things. Also, as a master block belt myself, and Chris kind of joined at the hip from that perspective too.
Thanks, Jim.
So with that, just about EIG, I'm the managing partner. Some people call me the master integrator. We have over 80 partners of consultants, consulting companies, and SaaS providers, and covering education, but covering everything from strategy to execution. We focus on creating the 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 = infinity, meaning we develop joint services between our partners to provide overall competitive advantage for you, the customer, to solve your problems. So we're not a one-trick pony, so to speak. But we have excellent talent like Chris and Greg in our team, amongst the other folks and other companies that are part of EIG. Again, we look to link strategy to execution. The old bicycle slide is the front wheel, that sprocket by your feet is the strategy that's driving your company, and execution is making you go. So we link those two things together, and link all the time horizons, strategic, tactical, and operations, and align our services of all our partners aligned to your needs of your company to make your company run the best it can. So with that, we're going to go to the agenda, and Greg's going to take it from here. Greg?
You bet. Thanks a lot, Jim. We thought we'd start with something called strategic framing. All right. And there are several other elements of the agenda, but I'll just ask Jim to move through the other agenda items, and we'll move to something we call stimulus and response stories. So we'll talk about each one of these sections. We thought we'd start with this, a stimulus and response story. We call it teaching a dog new tricks, a little levity early in the morning here. But we want to give you some insights about stimulus response. So let's take a look at the next slide. We call this wishful thinking in terms of tariff pressure starting in February of this year, or what Donald Trump wanted. All right, so we put this together, and you can see on the top right, the yellow box, Trump's desire to look tough to the world. Okay, that fits right in with the man's Art of the Deal book. And he basically thought that this push-pull approach that has worked for him in the real estate arena over the years would work in a global ecosystem. All right. Well, down the bottom, he was hoping that would be the end game down at 6 o'clock, and it would end up basically very beneficial for the U.S. trade and the U.S. economy. The next slide, little different. Here's what Donald Trump got. All right, at 12 o'clock, what did he get? Immediately, he got tit for tat retaliation by all the entities that he spoke to. All right. Again, if you look at the top right, Trump's desire to look tough and utilize what he is comfortable with from the Art of the Deal book, this is truly a picture image of stimulus response. In theory of constraints, I'm a theory of constraints certified Jonah. We call it, we think about it as, if this particular decision happens, then this is going to happen because of this. It's cause and effect, or what we sometimes call this picture, unintended consequences of stimulus response. So again, this whole tariff approach, from Greg's point of view, is a black swan event. No one saw it coming. All right. It's still operating, as Jim mentioned. We'll see how it plays out, but we wanted to show you kind of what it looks like in terms of stimulus response, cause and effect, and unintended consequences. So with that, we'll just move into kind of get you grounded real quick before we move on and talk about stimuli and response definitions. Take a look on the left side. Stimuli, triggering events that necessitate supply chain actions. You can take a look at them, but the supply chain examples that you may be familiar with are an increase in new orders or drop in orders, supplier delays, geopolitical events, natural disasters, promotional campaigns, and now we're living with the injection of tariffs. On the right-hand side are the response definitions. Actions undertaken to adapt to triggering events and meet business objectives. Again, from a supply chain point of view on the bottom, examples can be the ability for production ramp up, inventory reallocation, supplier switching, maybe contingency deployment, forecast updates, route adjustments, and now reciprocal tariffs. So with that in mind, get you grounded. I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. And so the next section is diagnosing the problem, addressing those challenges and uncertain and unpredictable stimuli. And then Chris will get into the structural modeling, and then we'll get into some wrap-up things with designing for resilience from reactive to strategic, and then we'll do some case studies. So on to diagnosing the problem. The first one is information timing is critical, and is for the supply chain excellence. The second is the time lag of information up and down the supply chain creates indecision, lack of trust, and increases costs and impacts to the bottom line. So we're seeing that, quite a bit of that. And then the third quote we see is, if only I could understand what a supplier's intent or problem is, much earlier, I could then help the supplier solve the problem, and everyone would benefit. So if we shared the information earlier, then there'd be less ripple effects that Chris mentioned. The next quote that we heard quite a bit was, holding face-to-face discussions with suppliers and customers is the key to successful supply execution. So talking really helps, especially face-to-face. Get to know your partners up and down the supply chain. The next quote we had was, collaboration and co-creation is paramount to supply chain success. And then, of course, speed is life in supply chain. So if we can communicate faster up and down the supply chain, we can take cost out of the supply chain and make it cheaper. but then you have to collaborate and co-create. Trust is all about not being scared. So people are scared, so they don't trust, so they retaliate, but it's a fear of losing something that erodes that trust. So with that, the next thing that we looked at is what are challenges in proactively managing stimuli? Uh, Uncertainty of the order stream. We may not know what that is. The supplier inability to deliver due to unplanned events. So these are very common challenges. Lack of capability to react to a change in demand or supply. Lack of timeliness of informing upstream and downstream partners of a change. So it's almost like you're embarrassed to let people know, or you don't want to cry wolf and say things too often and then go back on your word. So how do you communicate when you do have something, you know, and need to know? You know, you often see, well, when they need to know, we'll tell them, but by the time they need to know, it's too late. So that's a challenge. Lack of understanding your upstream and downstream suppliers, their constraints. So you're assuming you know what your supplier, your customer's constraints. So you're making decisions for them that creates a backlash on you. A siloed mindset. So even within your own four walls, not sharing information within your own company so that they can share it with the people outside your company is causing problems. So these are all things that we received. Probably you've all heard these things over the years if you work in supply chain, but these were common threads that we received out of our work so far. So with that, we're going to ask you, what are you doing to manage stimuli and response situations that we just discussed? How are you managing them proactively? Some people are hoping for the best. Some people are escalating things. Others are doing scenario planning. Others are procrastinating more, driving it more into the deep abyss, so to speak. Some people say, well, we cover that in quarterly planning, which is a type of event that is not going to help you because it's all rear view mirror type of planning. So with that, I'll throw it out to Greg first. I know he has a lot of thoughts in this area.
Oh, thanks, Jim. I really like the boldness of scenario planning. We're big advocates of scenario planning and digitalization of the supply chain, not just to do that, but to be able to model certain risk scenarios, all right, to be able to see what your financial impacts are if you lose a supplier, and also a lot of our exemplar clients are running tariff what ifs. So very, very encouraged to see that scenario planning is emboldened, I'll say, because this is a frequency table. So very good. It helps you mitigate, identify, assess, and mitigate those tariff issues.
Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, this is, let me pop back on. Sorry. Agree. I really like kind of following Greg here, the scenario planning. A lot of what we do sometimes, you made a mention of it, Jim, is looking in the rear view mirror. And what we really have to do, a lot of this stuff is you need to be a lot more proactive and not a lot more predictive. So there needs to be some sort of forward thinking that's not just looking at what happened in the past and reacting to that, but to try to think about new situations that you haven't seen yet. So scenario planning and what we will show in just a little bit, the structural modeling, help a lot along those lines.
Nice. So we'll revisit this, keep on entering into this particular poll EV, as well as enter into the chat any comments you have, questions you have throughout. So now we're going to get to the real guts of this webinar with Chris on structural modeling.
Fantastic. Back on. So if y'all have seen some of our other webinars, then you've probably seen this Venn diagram. Love this. We're sitting right in the middle here where there's these three kind of elements coming together. You've got in the lower left the STO, strategic tactical operational perspective, and having some balance there. And then at the top is the strategic risk paradox, where we tend to spend a lot of money on operational things that financially don't have a huge impact when you look at the total financial picture. And we don't spend much time on strategic issues and strategic risks that really have the huge impact. It's turned upside down there, so we need to pay more attention. So now we're in the lower right, which is the simulation. Structural modeling is the type of simulation we do. And what's interesting is what that diagram you saw with Trump's tariffs is a perfect example of structural modeling. That is a structure that holds no matter how much Trump decides to increase or decrease tariffs. That all still plays true. And so that's the power of structural modeling. It incorporates all that stimuli and response. And the idea is that now we can model how other companies in the supply chain act and react and respond to their stimuli. And now we can see the supply chain as a system. And all this leads to this proactive planning in this VUCA world that we find ourselves stuck in now. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to build on what we did last time. So if you hadn't seen the last one, I'll kind of give a refresh here, but we're going to build from there and continue. So what we did last time was looked at a supply chain, and we were going to look at how that supply chain acted and reacted when different entities in that supply chain acted alone versus acting together and collaborating. A lot of what Greg and Jim have talked about and they've discovered with their trust initiative. But we went through one scenario where we just did a bump in demand, 25% increase in demand, and let it run through the system. It was sustained. The next scenario we did, we bumped it up and then dropped it back down because we wanted to see, when everyone's still adjusting to the increase, what happens if the floor drops a little bit and we decrease and now we're heading down. And so what does that do? So that was our second scenario. Then and this was only looking at an OEM and a tier 1. So then in scenario 3, we added a tier 2. And we kept that same demand pattern, because that's what's great about some of this structural modeling and simulation is you can do these experiments, design of experiments, scientific experiments, where you hold everything constant and just change one thing. So that demand is still the same, up, down, a step up and a step down, but now we're adding to that supply chain. So in scenario 3, second tier was added. And then in scenario 4, we add a third tier. So now we've got this a 4-tier supply chain, OEM, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And what we also introduced were some metrics that are specific to resilience. When we see some oscillations, you see bullwhip effect, and you see these oscillations as entities respond and react. And we had 3 that we were looking at. The first is the amplitude. That's sort of the maximum minus the minimum that we see in these oscillations. So how big is that? How chaotic? The time to recover is once I start seeing a change to when I kind of start to settle down, not exactly settled down, but close to settling down. And then cycles and swings. How many up-down combinations do I have? So in this example, we're showing 3. We're showing you the amplitude, the high minus the low, the time to recover, and then the 3 cycles. So we were using those metrics to sort of judge good, bad of changes happening. So what we ended with last time when we showed collaboration was the all high. So for each of these entities, we sort of dialed how aggressive they were with controlling their inventory, making up their desired finished goods inventory. Were they aggressive to where they might end up over ordering sometimes because they want to quickly refill that gap? Or were they more kind of slowly responding, more conservative? So we picked the all high. Everyone in the supply chain was very reactive, very aggressive. And you see the bump in demand and then goes down, and you see everyone responding. You see the typical bullwhip effect that we know about, but now with structural modeling, we can actually show the magnitude of it. And the biggest zigzag you see are for the tier 3. And then the smallest one, that blue line right in the middle there, is your OEM. So we see it get worse and worse as it goes out. You also see that in the chart down below. Look at the amplitude, 57% for OEM, so not too bad, 95 for tier 1, 157 for tier 2, 211% for tier 3. That keeps growing. The time to recover is also growing, and the cycles are also growing. So in this case, the further you are into that supply chain, if we had a tier 5, tier 4, tier 5, we just see it continue to get worse. Now, what we showed last time was that if all the companies worked together and did the exact same thing, they all implemented lean. In this case, it was lean. We showed that if one company implemented lean, it didn't do that, make that big of a change. But if all the companies reduce their cycle times for production and reduce their safety stock, they almost completely eliminate that bullwhip effect when they're all working together. When I move left, everyone's moving left. When I move right, everyone's moving right. And everyone benefited in this scenario. So what we showed before, and if you watch the previous webinar, is that when each company acted individually and made these improvements, it really didn't always result in improvements for everybody. But if they all work together, everyone does very, very well. So that's what we did last time, and that's what we're going to come into this time. So last time we looked at collaboration, and now what we're going to look at are some other elements of focusing on trust, other elements of how we show trust in the supply chain. And there are two common responses that tend to limit trust as we act and react in supply chains. On the left, you've got holding additional inventories. I'm going to have extra buffer inventories because I don't trust what's happening. The other on the right is holding my orders or delaying my orders. So I'm not giving you the orders as they really are coming. I'm kind of holding them for whatever reasons, and so not giving that to you. So those are the two changes we're going to now look at. Last time was collaboration. Now we're looking at additional inventory and holding orders. And what we're also going to do is, out of the scenarios we ran last time, instead of using the highly aggressive scenario from last time, we're going to use the one where everyone's kind of medium. So we had everyone was aggressive, everyone was sort of, in the middle, and then everyone was conservative. I'm going to take those two extremes away, and let's just pick this. Everyone sort of has a moderate reaction because that's most common. And so that's where we're going to start with. This is our baseline now that we're going to start working with. So what we'll do is we're going to start showing the impact of each company doing something on their own. So this first, what you're going to see, I'm always on the left there, that's our baseline. That's what we're comparing to. And in the first scenario, we're going to say that only the OEM doubles their buffer. So we're looking at buffer inventory, remember, and one by one, we're going to walk through everybody doing this. So here, only the OEM doubles their buffer inventory. Now, in the chart, what you see is green means it got better, yellow means it got a little bit worse. So the OEM, when the OEM doubles their buffer, their performance metrics get better. You can see the comparison. The amplitude's 48% compared to 57% in our quote baseline in this situation. But everyone else was worse. So now let's go to tier 1. So now the OEM does not, and only the tier 1. Well, you'll notice that the OEM doesn't benefit from that. The tier 1 benefits, and then the tier 2 and tier 3 do not benefit from that. And so let's keep going through. We're going to go through the other two right now. So now, if the tier 2, again, we'll hold on the left the baseline that we're looking at, but now if the tier 2 doubles their buffer inventory, you'll see the OEM and the tier 1 don't benefit. The tier 2 does, and the tier 3 does not. It gets a little bit worse. And so finally, let's see what happens if the tier 3 doubles their buffer. And you'll notice no changes to anybody, but tier 3 gets a little bit of a benefit. So what's interesting that we can look at all those, and you probably already saw the pattern, but we'll make it real explicit on this next slide, where this is now a relationship. When we start talking about the physics of supply chains, this is what we're talking about. So the impact of holding this buffer inventory is that you may benefit, what we saw, you may benefit, but the rest of the upstream supply chain actually suffers, which means eventually you're going to get a bullwhip. If we were to run longer simulations, you might get a bullwhip later on. There are no benefits to anyone downstream from you. So we're going to lay out this little matrix here, and on the left is the implementer of the buffer inventory, and then we're going to look at the beneficiaries going across the right. So in this first line here, we're showing that the OEM, when the OEM implements additional buffer inventory, the OEM gets better, but everyone else gets worse. But now when the tier one does it, you'll notice nothing happens to the OEM. The tier one gets better, and the other two, the other ones upstream get worse. So maybe you're starting to see the pattern here. So now when the tier two does it, nothing happens to the OEM in the tier one. The tier two gets better. The tier three does not. And now when the tier three does it, you see no one downstream gets better. The tier three is fine, but in this case, the tier three is the end of the supply chain. So this is an actual relationship. This is physics now that we can look at that says when you implement buffer inventory, all things stay unequal and you do it yourself, everybody downstream from you, no one benefits from it. And everybody upstream from you actually suffers. So you are doing better, but no one in later is doing better, and everyone earlier is actually suffering, because what happens is when you're doubling your inventory, you're doubling orders, and everyone else is having to it's already kicking off that bullwhip effect to the others. So this is a good, interesting sort of lesson in physics that you can take with you and just applies in general. So that's the buffer inventory. We said we'd also look at holding orders. And people may say, well, why do we hold orders? Well, there's several reasons, but we don't want to say anything because we think demand might change. And so let's not make a big order or a small order in case demand changes. Or to be more efficient, we want to batch some of our orders. So instead of sending 10, 10, 10, we're going to send 30. And then sometimes it's not looking too good and we just kind of don't want to share that information yet. And so we're procrastinating a little bit and kind of, trying to avoid the inevitable. But let's begin to build some physics here and begin to understand. We're going to look at a couple of things. The first thing is order backlog impact. So what we also did, I'm only looking at the OEM and tier one. This gets very complicated when you start looking beyond that. So we're only considering the OEM and the tier one just so we can draw these matrices and kind of learn from it. So what you see is that for each of them, you can have a 0 week, means I'm giving you all my information, a 1 week delay or a 2 week delay. And right here, if the OEM, if the tier one stays at 0, so the tier one is still ordering like they're supposed to. And here the OEM has said there's 3 situations. There's a situation of not changing, not delaying a week, delaying 2 weeks. And you'll see that the upstream order backlogs begin to grow. So if you look, the spikes start to get bigger and bigger. And so there's this, as we delay, we are introducing the bullwhip effect. Now, if the tier one also does this by themselves, and notice that there's no change for the OEM, so now we're at the top part of this matrix, notice that same thing happens. We go from little ripples to bigger ripples, and sometimes even these delays in between. So we are creating this bullwhip effect. So when both the OEM and the tier one delay their orders, you see this diagonal here. And at the bottom, when they're both delaying 2 weeks, that's the worst situation. You got this double whammy. And so you don't just know all these charts are on the same scale. So it's all relative. You can see massive oscillations. And so what happens when we're holding orders is we're impacting the order backlog. It's getting worse. Everybody upstream from us gets worse. Let's go ahead and look at another metric. Let's look at finished goods inventories. So again, we're withholding orders, and we've shown the impact on order backlog. We're drawing the exact same chart here, matrix for finished goods inventory. So same thing. If the tier one does not delay, but the OEM either no delay, 1 week delay, or a 2 week delay, you can see these inventories grow. So the upstream inventories are growing for my other tier one, tier two, tier three are all growing. Same thing if the OEM does not delay, but the tier one does, we see again that same impact. Everybody upstream, their inventories grow. They're having to hold more inventory to account for your withholding orders and delaying orders and everything. And now that diagonal, same thing as before, we just get a double whammy when both the OEM and the tier one delay their orders. It just gets worse for everybody down the chain. And I mean, look at the upper right image chart versus the lower right and just look at the difference there. Massive difference. And again, we're only doing OEM and tier one. We could continue and show tier two and tier three, but it just gets, you can just imagine it just gets worse. So the other thing we want to look at is lead time. So we're looking at all these performance metrics just to kind of understand what's happening sort of across the board. So we've looked at orders, backlogs growth, finished goods inventory growth, and now we're going to look at lead times. So we're going to do the same thing. Down the left here is that the tier one doesn't delay their orders, but the OEM delays doesn't, and then delays a week, delays 2 weeks. And again, those lead times, you're looking at them, same chart, they get delayed and they get bigger. I mean, that's exactly the bullwhip effect. Let's go across the top, and now the OEM is holding or giving their orders immediately, but the tier one is withholding. And we see, again, that delay and growth, delay and growth. And now if we do the diagonal and both the OEM and the tier one do this, you see that double whammy, and you see everyone else in the upstream in the supply chain begin to grow also. All those triangles are getting really big. So the last one we want to look at, so on all those performance metrics, it looks bad. You are influencing, you are hurt. The more you delay your orders, the more you are introducing bullwhip, and the more you are hurting the upstream part of your supply chain, which of course eventually comes back to hurt you. So the last thing we're going to look at is very interesting. If you've got a warehouse and you're putting raw material goods in there, you're putting finished goods in there, and as you get overwhelmed with one versus the other, you got to do all this shifting. And so what we're going to look at is the fraction of our inventory that's raw material compared to finished goods, and see how that changes, because that means you're shifting a lot of stuff. You're having to move everything around. You're having to maybe you don't have space, but you're having to make additional space, things like that. So now let's look at when there's let's look at that left line here. So the tier one, no delays, but we've got no delay, 1 week and 2 week for the OEM. And notice that the OEM is starting to cause its own problems. So the more in the short term, the OEM is saying, hey, I'm going to delay orders because that's beneficial to me. But in the long term, it actually hurts the OEM, because you can see that it causes these problems. So now let's go across and you can see that oscillation. This is a lot of movement in the warehouse. So now we look at the tier one. If the tier one does this and the OEM does not, notice there's no change for the OEM. So the only impacts are upstream. There's no downstream impact. So the raw material stays, the fraction of raw material stays the same for everyone downstream, but not upstream. But let's do that double whammy again and see what that does. And you'll notice these charts look just like the ones on the left. So it's all the OEM. The OEM is the only one in this case causing the problem, because they are affecting everyone upstream. The tier one does not affect the OEM. If it was the tier two, then both the tier one and OEM would not be affected, and we would see that throughout and see that same dynamic. But it's very interesting to see, because this is a lot of churn in your warehouse is what this means. And so that short-term pain relief of I'm not going to share my order information, I don't trust my supply chain, actually ends up hurting you. So what does this what does this mean? Well, when we delay our orders, number one, we're just crushing the supply chain, and we're adding to the bullwhip effect. We got more oscillations, higher oscillations, takes us a lot longer to recover, and eventually this impacts everybody in the supply chain, even you. It might not be immediate. And then eventually these oscillations in the supply chain lead to oscillations in your finished goods and raw material, which, like we said, that's difficult to manage the warehouse. There may be constraints with customer deliveries, and your profit margin may suffer because you're not selling, you don't have room for finished goods to sell, and you're accumulating other materials. So big impact on that. So now I want to just kind of summarize the physics part of it. What have we learned? So counterintuitive, the material in the supply chain flows downstream, so we think we might only be impacting downstream partners. In reality, we have a much bigger impact on our upstream suppliers than we typically realize. So when we hold extra inventory, we're adding to that bullwhip. That's all upstream from us. When we hold orders, we're adding to that bullwhip. That's all upstream for us. So that's counterintuitive. We typically think because material is flowing down the supply chain and I'm only impacting people that I'm companies that I'm sending materials to. That's not the case. It's reverse. We're actually hurting the upstream part of the supply chain. And then second, this is what we just kind of really highlighted with that, the raw material, is that a lot of the actions that we take to alleviate pain in the short term often lead to bigger pains in the long term. And you can kind of compare this with things like diet and exercise. If I really want those long-term gains, I'm going to sort of suffer. So the counterintuitive part is if we really want these resilient solutions, we're going to have a little discomfort in the short term to get to those long-term gains. And over on the right, again, like Greg says, a little bit of levity, we've got collaboration. That's how we used to solve these problems. It historically is just big bat, and we're just gonna, the beatings shall now begin, and we'll get everything in shape. But really, it's the structural elements of this system that are causing all these problems, and that's very difficult to overcome without understanding the supply chain as a system. And so, Jim, I'll turn it back over to you now.
We'll just turn it back over to the audience, and we welcome your questions. Chris had shared an awful lot of stuff right there. I think we've all been in that warehouse over time, and we're in a bullwhip effect, and people are turning off orders, beating up suppliers, and we're actually igniting the system and making it worse. And I think that's what that analysis shows. So clearly, that's not even without igniting it. But generally, what happens is people will cut off orders, try to get lower costs, try to get commitments, and it just hurt everything upstream and downstream in the supply chain. I'm sure we've all been on the floor when that happens. Those strategic decisions that management makes actually perturbates and escalates problems. So, the scenario planning helps, but all these things help. But a lot of it is just understanding that everything we have, it fits together. It's all one ecosystem. So if you beat somebody up, there will be payback eventually. And you may not like what you get. You might not even see it coming. Greg, your thoughts?
It's a rather complicated cause and effect relationship. So appreciate everyone hanging in there with us because some of it is not real intuitive in our supply chain arena. So I applaud I applaud Chris in terms of going through the cause and effect relationships for you, the audience. So
absolutely. Chris, any closing comments on this?
Yeah, it just gets, at least from my perspective, more and more obvious this need for getting beyond spreadsheets. I forget some McKinsey report that said that like 76% of companies use spreadsheets for this long-term analysis, and we got to get beyond that to something that's more cause and effect related, causal structure, and that's where the structural modeling comes in. And we just saw we were able to kind of by piecing through these individual experiments, we can build a set of relations, a set of physics of understanding how our decisions are impacting everybody and then turning around to impact us in the long term.
Thank you. So please keep your questions flowing in the chat. And with that, we'll move on to the next section is designing for resilience from reactive to strategic. So we try to summarize here some challenges to proactively manage stimuli and giving some best practices we've seen throughout the years. We'll start off with uncertainty of the order stream that we've been talking about quite a bit. And some proposed actions is deploy some behavioral analytics and isolate true demand signals and use predictive modeling. And I would even add to this what it says here is the whole idea of a stochastic, probabilistic stochastic. We don't live in a linear world, and everything's dynamic. So if you're using a linear tool to model a nonlinear problem and you're trying to get right half the time, you'll probably get right 20% of the time. So you're better odds at 50-50 odds. So you're rolling your dice with a lot of your action plans is what we're getting at. And that's why and today with AI, we have a lot of tools out there to use that can be used. You can use digital twins, but make sure you're using a digital twin. You're not using a model of a model of a model. You're actually using actual data. So one of the biggest fallacies of data simulations is using assumptions of the signals. It should be the actual signals. Then the next is lack of capability to react to supply demand changes, enable dynamic reallocation and scenario planning. We've talked about that. We do have a tool out there we just launched, Change Site AQ, that does the probabilistic stochastic analysis because you can't do it in real time. It includes the scenario planning. So there are some other tools out there, but look for tools that can help you with that probabilistic stochastic problem that's out there. In today's world, we have it. And Greg was doing it back in 2000 and he needed a Cray computer. And now we can start doing it ourselves with AI. Um, the next is lack of timeliness of informing partners of capability changes. Establish those protocols and trust matrices, how you're going to react, who owns what, collaborate with your folks up and downstream, communicate. You probably will never communicate enough. And then the next is lack of understanding of partners' constraints. Try to understand what your partners are going through. Don't assume that you know what they're going through. Even if you used to work in an area or you used to work for the company and used to be in the other one's shoes, most likely the assumptions and constraints are different in the ecosystem that you have today. So you really need to continue to talk to each other and don't assume you know. And then next, siloed mindset and data sharing. This is what our project is about that we're working on. This research 1-year program is, foster the psychological safety of sharing information internally and externally. Be transparent, leverage tools like SCMBLOX, even our other partner Creatisoft on looking at this data. And this trustworthy data sharing is the key to addressing all these challenges. So with that, we thought we'd just kind of break it up. We're kind of getting into that part of the webinar where we have a guy there that made a great quote a number of years ago. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So that's what I feel like when I'm on the floor. That's what I felt like when we just kept doing the same things over analyzing things, overdoing things, and that caused a lot of problems. With that, I'll turn it over to Greg.
Yep, you bet. Before we get into, and we've talked about this, before we get into a case, we have a little bit of a caselet for you. I wanted to answer Patrick's question because it's kind of near and dear to my heart.
Great.
The question was, are any non-retail companies utilizing CPFR, collaborative planning, forecasting, and replenishment? Outside of retail, Patrick, I'm not sure about that. In the retail arena, way back when, absolutely implemented CPFR in the 90s. It worked, and it worked for Home Depot and Lowe's. They were our customers. We had unbelievably good data from a sales point of view to both of those big box companies. They were growing by 500 stores a year each. We shared our projection of what product and demand they would potentially see over a course of 3 months, like a horizon. It worked out very, very well. We shared our data. They came back and essentially said plus or minus 10%. That looks good. That's going to be our order line, and you ship it to us, and we'll be happy. So it does mitigate the bullwhip effect, and it also drove top line revenue growth and market share. Good point. Good point. It is a methodology. How many non-retail companies, because it grew up in the retail sector, how many of those companies are utilizing CPFR right now? I can't say, because if they are, nobody talks about it anymore because it's your strategic advantage. But I
Well,
wanted to answer your question.
hey, Greg, I'll hop in there real fast, and I've got a little knowledge there. I don't have, like you say, there's not a lot of information out there, but the information that I do have, it is a difficult. Any of that kind of forecasting is still very statistical in nature, which requires a somewhat stable, requires a good set of data, a good understanding of the scenarios, and that you have data related to them. And so retail is a much easier industry to do that in. But you get outside of retail and you get little, disruptions and delays in shipping and these kinds of things happening that have a bigger impact. And the even that approach begins to break down because it is very data oriented, and you need something that's more structural to understand how the entire system responds. So
Mhm.
I'll just throw that in there for the non-retail version.
Yep, you bet. Okay, good, good,
Then
good.
maybe Greg, you finish this slide, and then we'll go back to the chat to answer some questions.
Yeah, well, this is more or less what Chris covered. Chris covered the two levels of counterintuitive. Uh, uh, we actually maybe call it something like the strategy paradox, but Chris basically gave you a summarization on the two counterintuitive issues that we've talked about. So with that, I'm ready to move on.
Okay, so maybe we'll just go to the chat here. Uh, I think Mark asked a question way back and I missed it. I apologize. Says, please
Yeah.
explain how there's no impact downstream. Do you have an answer for that, Chris? You know,
I do. And so in the scenarios that we looked at, what we're showing is that the impact is negligible. It didn't necessarily get better, didn't necessarily, but it didn't get worse in the metrics that we were looking at. And I mean, we showed that on the charts. So in that regard, we're not saying there are benefits. And in fact, like the buffer inventory, we showed specifically there was no benefit downstream from that. It only helped you. Nothing else got better downstream. You were able to meet at the same level that you were able to meet before. So I think that covers that. I saw another question. We talked about Patrick's, but Selepe had a question. What is the impact of the length of lead times, for example, local versus import via ship, with regard to the impact of who holds buffer inventories? And Felipe, we did not look at that example. That's a more complicated. We could look at something like that, but what we did was held everything else constant and only changed one thing. So when we showed the impact on lead times, that was not related to buffer inventories. That was only related to delaying orders, holding orders, and procrastinating on the orders. So it wasn't a combined. We never did a combined scenario of holding orders plus buffer inventory, different shipping approaches. So we didn't get that complicated. We kept it fairly simple to just isolate how this one change could have an impact. But obviously, in the real world, you have lots of changes that come together. Again, the power of structural modeling and simulation is that you can grab all that and put all that into a model. But for your question, we did not specifically create a scenario to answer that.
but Chris, a while back in our last series, we did study the impact of uh, overseas versus local and the
We
impact of that buffer. So maybe you can talk to that.
we did. Okay, so that's a good one. In a previous webinar, what we found is that when there were disruptions, we were looking specifically at disruptions in the supply chain, and the deeper in the supply chain, tier one, tier two, tier three, the deeper that disruption is, the less it has an impact on the OEM, because every company between that disruption and the OEM, we're very focused on the OEM at that point. Every company in between acts as a buffer. They react, they recover a little bit, and so every layer of the supply chain does a little bit, and by the time it gets to the OEM, it's less. So the deeper the disruption in the supply chain, the less it impacts the top OEM in the supply chain. Also, geographically, the further away a supplier is, it also has less of effect, because the longer shipping routes that are there longer tend to have more inventory, and they sort of act like buffer inventory as well. And so it helps to alleviate some of that. So the deeper you are and the further geographically you are from the OEM in our situation, the less impact it had.
Excellent. If we missed anything in the chat, I don't think we did, but if we did, maybe just ask it again and we apologize and we'll be more attentive. Oh, my apologies. With that, Greg, close us out on section 5.
You bet. Well, we thought we'd give you a case. We have somewhat of a pseudo case here that we want to share with you as kind of a going away gift in terms of the discussion. So before we talk about this academic article, as a career academicians, I get supply chain and risk articles coming across my desk every day. We felt this one we're going to talk about was very timely and kind of thought provoking. So we want to kind of share with you kind of some of the hypotheses and then some of the findings, and then we'll close out the discussion. This article comes from a host of academicians. They represent the University of Wollongong in South Wales, Australia, Melbourne, Australia, Lancaster University in the UK, and the Department of Operations and Supply Chain out of Adelaide, Australia. Thought it was very, very interesting. Before we get into the definitions, these folks did a literature search resulting in this observation. They said, well, a lot of research out there has identified a range of what we call antecedents that foster supply chain resilience, but without distinguishing between those that are sufficient and those that are necessary. We use those terms in theory of constraints as well. So these guys hypothesized that supply chain visibility, responsiveness, flexibility, and collaboration are necessary antecedents of good supply chain resilience. And what they did is they went about attempting to prove or disapprove that hypothesis. So with that, we'll give you their definitions of the 4 elements, and then Jim can give you a sense of their findings. Fire away. Let's just talk supply chain visibility. That's one of them. What is that? Access to accurate, timely data from systems, partners, markets. Of course, it enables proactive disruption detection. That's what we feel. We all talk about that. Or what is it really? Visibility is not just seeing, but it's knowing what you see, when to see it, and how to act. Let's talk about another term. Responsiveness. What is that? Capability to quickly adapt and take action during changes. So it minimizes the losses and ensures business continuity. Or flexibility is a muscle that lets supply chain responsiveness, lets supply chain bend without breaking. So visibility, responsiveness. Let's keep going. Next level, supply chain flexibility, capacity to dynamically adjust processes and resources. It enables reconfiguration while maintaining competitiveness, or responsiveness is the heartbeat of resilience. It's what keeps operations alive under pressure. All right. The other side of the 4th element is really collaboration. We talked about that. What is that? inter-firm capability to recover together in independent networks. A unified recovery approach, which is what Chris was talking about, that collaboration turns fragmented networks into unified systems. So there are the four definitions as they saw it in their study. I'll turn it over to Jim and he can give you kind of
Yeah.
the
So the
final.
drum roll is, which of these do you think are antecedents of supply chain resilience? So come up with your answer. You got four things. Are all four of them, two of them, one of them, none of them? What do you guys think? So at least think about that before we get to the answer or their answer that they were able to come up with from their study. So they come up with, they're using this necessary condition analysis, NCA, which is a research method used to identify must-have conditions, those that are absolutely required for a particular outcome to occur. Unlike traditional statistical approaches, this focuses on sufficiency, just like Greg mentioned, what factors increase the likelihood of an outcome. NCA zeroes in on necessity. It is the condition is missing, the outcome is impossible, no matter what else is present. So these are represented, the results are represented in a p-value or a probability value, which is a measure of how it helps you determine whether it is observed to be consistent with specific hypothesis, usually the null hypothesis, which assumes that no effect or relationship between the variables. So what it shows here in these plots, and you can go and look at the paper yourselves, but we try to summarize as best we can, is visibility and flexibility are not antecedents of supply chain resilience. So, so visibility and flexibility are not. However, responsiveness and collaboration are significant. And again, this is a survey that Greg mentioned from all those firms in Australia, 479 manufacturing firms. And so the critical truth revealed is responsiveness and collaboration are not optional. They are foundational prerequisites for supply chain resilience. And what's really interesting is as we're doing this research, what people are saying aligns very closely to this, right, Greg? What we're finding. I mean, because we focus everything on transparency, and we're kind of finding, well, transparency, what is transparency, visibility, flexibility? We kind of started seeing that it wasn't exactly aligned in reality. And so, without responsiveness and collaboration, even the most advanced systems fail to adapt under pressure. So this is a collaboration, co-creation. We found that when you did that, you had a much more resilient supply chain is when you co-collaborate and co-create up and down the supply chain because you co-own the materials up and down. So then you are co-vested. It's a vesting type of a framework, and there are vesting frameworks out there. And so that's one thing that I found quite interesting. And so reframing this resilience from a capability to a condition is really the outcome that came out of this report. Greg, I'm sure you have some additional comments.
Oh, it's great. It's again somewhat counterintuitive, folks, because if you're still with us, most of us in supply chain constantly talk about visibility, get better visibility. True, true. But this is the first time that we've seen that, okay, necessary versus sufficient.
Yeah,
Sufficient is table stakes now, folks.
yeah.
Necessary is an antecedent to go forward with resilience. So
And,
very, very thought provoking from our point of view.
and as Greg said, table stakes, if you know the Kano diagram, the must-haves, that's table stakes. So what used to be a nice to have or something that's valued is now table stakes. So maybe 5 years ago, it was true. But today, in today's world, these are must-be's, must-haves. Very interesting for us. So, Greg, the moral of the story here.
Yep, we'll try to close it out here. The moral of our story, folks, is this. First, individual companies do have significant impact the longer they withhold information. Second, coordinated supply chains operate more effectively. Hopefully you've witnessed that. And third, responsiveness and collaboration are key elements to building a resilient enterprise. We agree with that. And the net from us to you is trust drives policy. That's our story, and we're sticking to it. I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks. And so what can you do now? Business continuity planning, scenario planning, and if you're intrigued by this structural modeling approach, Beer Game on Steroids is a free version that we allow people to use. It's a simple, we've actually used it in the last webinar and part of this webinar as well. That some of the results you see are from that. But anyway, beergameonsteroids.com. If you go there, you'll get taken to, and you can download that and use it. But what we've shown so far, we've shown different impacts of how the impacts on order fulfillment and inventory and things like that. And as you, like Greg said, coordinate, we talked about the inventory control as if companies are operating sort of differently in how they're looking at safety stock, their production times, their inventory control, all that, and how they're reacting, you can have vastly different results. But when they're all working together, coordinating, and so I know when I do something, my suppliers are going to follow suit, then that's the real trust. There's trust in data, but trust in policies, as Greg and Jim were saying. And so this is really kind of the gist of what we're suggesting is that coordination is key. Jim, I know you probably have some more thoughts along those lines.
Well, we're running out of time, but I guess, my summary would be that, we live in a dynamic world. If you try to model things in a dynamic world and nonlinear world with linear tools, it's not going to work. And now we have the tools, Chris's tools and other partners of EIG and SCRMC, all of our team, we have the tools to help you through these perturbations to model your system as it is today or what it could be tomorrow. And it's a very exciting time for us all to get out of the box of linear thinking and start actually doing systems thinking, things that we've been doing since the 90s and 2000s. Now we can actually model that with your tool, Chris. So we
Yes.
really, that's what Greg and I get really excited about, is we can start actually modeling these things that we used to hypothetically think about.
Yeah.
Your tool, and you can help a lot of companies solve a lot of their systems problems,
Yeah.
and be proactive in restructuring their company.
Yeah. Great comment. It is a system problem. It's not just an individual company.
With that, hopefully we hit the deliverables that you were expecting today. And please do follow up with any questions to us. We'd be more than glad to answer them. We will be having our webinar next month on redesigning the chain, modeling the strategic implications of tariffs and onshoring and restructuring. And with that, we'll close it out. Greg, you want to go first?
I can only say, hope we provided a few thought-provoking insights for you today, folks.
From my perspective, I'll just say this is the tip of the iceberg. If keep watching the other webinars, and you will continue to learn more about just the power of this type of structural modeling and what it can do to help understand supply chains as a system, because resilience is a system phenomenon, not an individual company.
Well said. So thanks, everyone. I want to thank everybody for sticking in. And we apologize for going over a bit, but hopefully you learned something. And we learn something every time we give these webinars. And we really enjoy the feedback. And so keep the feedback going. Don't wait till next webinar. Reach out. Thanks so much and have a great day.
Thanks,
Cheers.
everybody.